UIKit. Did you know that UI stands for user interface? And you've actually used this library several times before, mostly through the storyboard by dragging objects from the object library onto your view. I mentioned before that those objects that you're dragging from the object library to your view, they are objects of classes that exist inside UIKit. So in this lesson, I'd like to dive a little deeper into UIKit and tell you what it's all about. Now here I've got the UIKit documentation from the Apple developer website. And you can access this documentation from any web browser by hitting the URL up here. Now, as a developer, it's really important to learn how to use the Apple documentation. Now, I'm gonna be honest, and I'm not gonna say that it's perfect all the time, but it's a great starting point. So it's very important to know how to navigate around it, how to find the information that you need, because no one knows everything. And so every single iOS developer relies on the documentation that is supplied from either like third-party libraries or, in this case, Apple libraries. So let's start by taking a look at what is here. Inside this UIKit framework, we have a lot of classes. Well, all of the classes are related to UI, or user interface, but there are only a subsection of those classes that are actual user element controls. So I'm going to point your attention to those because I think that typically you will be looking information up about the user interface elements that you're using. So I'm going to scroll down here. There are various categories about essentials, app structures, user interface. I'm going to go into views and controls. And then here you get to see a subset of some of the elements that are available for you to use and that you probably will be using. Labels, switches, date pickers, segmented controls, and if you scroll a little farther down, there's a listing of different controls. We're going to go into the UI image view because you've used that already, actually, back in Module 1 with the War card game. So let's dive inside that class. Now, typically for some of the more popular classes, such as this one, you're going to see an article, not just documentation, but a full-on article about what it is and how to use it. So that's pretty cool. But if you scroll farther down, yeah, so there's quite a bit of information here because the UI image view is used so often. But typically, you're not always going to see an article like that. What you're going to see is this sort of documentation. And when you get to become a more seasoned developer, this is really the information you're going to hone in on because this tells you exactly for the UI image view class what properties are available. And you know these are properties because they have this var keyword, just like you learned back in Module 1, declaring properties, right? This is the property name, and this is the data type that that property expects. Now, there are also methods, if you scroll down a little more, with this func, and you know that stands for a function. So you know that this is a method that you can call on the UI image view class, right? So typically what happens, even for me, is when I'm using a UIKit class that I'm unfamiliar with, I will pull up the documentation for that class, and if I'm wondering what I can do with that user interface element, I will look through this list, take a scan. Typically the method names are self-explanatory. Sometimes you may need to read the description or you can drill into it. So for example, let's go into the image property, one that we typically use. And it tells you what it's for and what you assign to it. And often cases when you are looking at methods of a class and you're not sure what the parameters mean and what that method expects, you can drill into the documentation to find out. So for example, this init method here accepts a couple of parameters, and sometimes the parameter names may be self-explanatory, sometimes they may be a little confusing, but if you visit that particular method, it's going to tell you for the parameters what it expects and what it represents. So that's really helpful. Now, one thing I want to add is that typically when you're looking for information about a class, you're not going to be browsing the UIKit documentation like we just are right here. You might initially, if you don't know what's available in UIKit, but generally you're not going to be browsing this documentation. You want to basically hone in on the exact class that you want to find out about, and you want that information right away. One good way of doing that, that's not foolproof but oftentimes works, is just Google the class name or the method name. And typically, if there is documentation about that class or about that method, it will be generally at the top. So for example, I Googled UI image view and I found this Apple developer documentation page, which brings you directly here, so you don't have to browse through the documentation. Furthermore, there are actually easier ways to find information from within Xcode, and that's what I'm going to tell you how to do right now. So here within Xcode, let's say you're working on some code. Here I've got a UI image view declared, and if this is maybe one of the first times I've worked with this class and I want some information on it, one easy way to get that is if you just put your typing cursor in the class name or the method name, and you go on the right hand side here in this inspector pane. You can click this button to toggle that pane if you don't see it, and there are also some sub tabs here. There is a quick help inspector, which gives you a summary and some general information about that class or method, and there's also a link to open it up in developer documentation. So if you needed more detail, you can go ahead and click that and look at that. We're jumping to exactly the same page. That's way faster than Googling it or browsing for it. Another thing that you can do is also hold down the Option key on your keyboard. When you do that, you can see your mouse cursor turns into this crosshair. And if you hover it over a certain method name like that, right, or a class name like this, and if you click it, it's going to bring up the quick help as well. So this information here is the same thing that you see on the right hand side right here. And that's just another way to do it. Now, another way, if you want to maybe see what's inside UIKit without using a web browser, just within Xcode here, you can go up to the window menu, you can drill down to developer documentation, and you can take a look at it. Remembered that I was looking at this, but you can see all of the different frameworks that are available in iOS. And that is why I'm telling you that no one knows everything, right? So that's why this documentation is so important. For example, UIKit right here, and open it up, and you can read all this stuff here. You can browse views and controls, same sort of information that we were seeing up on the website, but arguably this is easier to navigate and to browse. So here's the stack view, which you will be using. Actually, you've used that already in Module 1. So scroll view is one that you will be using in Module 3, and so on and so forth. And one last thing I want to mention is that there is a shortcut key to bring up this window if you didn't notice. So under Window, Developer Documentation, Command-Shift-0 brings this guy up. Alright, so in this lesson, you learned about where to find information on those UIKit classes and also how to bring up that information from within Xcode. Just to do a little recap, you can always take a look at the Apple documentation on their website. Or you could just type in the class name or function name into Google, and usually the top result is that reference page. Now from inside Xcode, you have several options to bring up some help. Number one, you can always put your typing cursor on the class or function name that you don't know about, and then on the right hand side in Xcode, inside the inspector pane, you're going to see some information about that function or class. Another thing you can do is hold down the Option key on your keyboard and then click that function or class name, and that's going to bring up the quick help, which shows you a little blurb about that function or class. And lastly, from within Xcode, you can always go up to the window menu, pull up the developer documentation, and that's going to pull up the in-app reference guide that is also searchable. So all of that's really great, and it's going to come in real handy as you're building your app. All right, that's it for this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.